Hi everybody, Dr. Ahles here. In this short video, I want to review the 4 hormone axes that we talked about by going back to one of our pictures from earlier in the chapter. And I also want to show you a picture that illustrates very clearly how each of these axes have an effect in the body. So I'm going to come back to this one. I know this one was really crazy, and the first time we saw it, our mind was blown. But I want to walk us through and remind us about a few things that are on it, and I've added a couple of notes to try to help us understand. So let's orient ourselves in this crazy, scary picture. Imagine in this picture that all of these neurons we see up here are neurons that live in the part of the brain called the hypothalamus. So that's that part, if you remember I talked to you about inside the brain, it kind of looks like the bill of a duck. This is the part that points down. The hypothalamus regulates both the anterior pituitary gland, that's the front side, and the posterior pituitary gland. Remember though, that in the posterior pituitary gland, it's actually those neurons from the hypothalamus that go all the way down into the posterior pituitary gland and spit out the hormones, antidiuretic hormone, which goes down to the kidneys, tells them, hey, pull in some more water, as well as the hormone oxytocin, which is one of the hormones involved in stimulating the production of milk, or bonding between mother and child. So on this side of my picture, we're looking at what's called the neurohypophysis, the second half, the posterior portion of the pituitary gland. Remember that the posterior pituitary gland does not make any hormones. Those hormones are made by the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary gland. For all of my other sections that I see on this crazy picture, we're looking at the pathways or the axes from the anterior pituitary gland, or what's called the adenohypophysis. When we look at the way that the front portion of the pituitary gland functions, this is going to involve both neurons and those kinds of cells that we called tropic cells. So let's start up here at the top again. Remember that each of these axes is going to start in the hypothalamus. That's what the H in the axis name stands for. So the hypothalamus has neurons that are present. Those neurons can spit out several different kinds of tropic hormones. So the job of these hormones that the hypothalamus spits out is to go down into the anterior pituitary gland and tell the anterior pituitary gland to spit out specific hormones that are going to activate different parts of the body. The hypothalamus creates these releasing hormones, or there's also inhibiting hormones. It creates these hormones and spits them out into something we didn't talk about directly, but is something you'll see in the textbook. It's this thing called the hypophysial portal system. That sounds super crazy. All it is the group of blood vessels that we find on what's called the infundibulum. What connects the hypothalamus, the bill of the duck, to the pituitary gland is this piece of tissue called the infundibulum. When we're looking at the back side of the pituitary gland, that's where I'd find those neurons going down into it, traveling directly through. But when I look at the front side, the anterior pituitary, instead of sending these hormones through the infundibulum, I spit them out into the blood vessels that are wrapped around it. So these blood vessels take the hormones that are made by the hypothalamus and bring them down to the anterior pituitary gland. In the anterior pituitary gland, we find those tropic cells. So if we look at our different axes that are labeled up here, let's use these labels to help us know which type of tropic cell we're seeing here. So this first tropic cell is involved in the hypothalamo-pituitary gonadal axis. If we were to label this particular cell, we would call this guy a gonadotroph. Then if we go back to that picture where I told you what gonadotrophs make, you'll remember that they make the hormones FSH and LH. So my gonadotroph got a message from the bloodstream wrapped around the infundibulum. That message came all the way from neurons that lived in the hypothalamus. It activates the gonadotroph, and they send their message down and ultimately impact the gonads. Next door, we're in the HPA axis now. So this cell that's hearing the CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone message, this cell is a corticotroph. It creates the hormone ACTH that's going to go down and talk to the adrenal gland. Next door, we're seeing a thyrotroph because this is part of the HPT axis. And if we jump over to the last axis that we learned about, the HPS axis, the cell I'm looking at right here is called a somatotroph. So all those troph cells that make particular hormones that are involved in each of these axes, those trophic cells live in the anterior part of the pituitary gland. And they spit out messages that go throughout the entire body to talk to these different organs. I love this picture to help us remember what each of my axes ultimately causes to happen. So we don't have it labeled on this picture, but you could definitely label it by yourself. Notice that this picture is starting with my trophic cells. So my trophic cells spit out gonadotropins. That's the hormones FSH and LH. FSH and LH are my two hormones that regulate the reproductive organs. We're looking at the HPG axis here. Now check this out. We not only see my target organs, who's going to hear FSH and LH, we also see what happens. When we have FSH and LH, this causes the testes or the ovaries to produce their gametes. That's sperm in the testes, that's eggs in the ovaries. So FSH and LH lead me to produce gametes, produce hormones. TSH, released by the thyrotrophs, talks to the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland makes thyroid hormones that ultimately increase the rate of metabolism. So if I have TSH, I'm going to make those thyroid hormones, which is going to increase my metabolic rate. Next door, we're into our HPA axis. Remember that the HPA axis was regulating stress. So my corticotroph spits out ACTH. When it spits that out, it goes down to the adrenal gland, talks to it, and various effects happen. So the adrenal gland is going to use those mineralocorticoids to change the body fluid balance. It's going to use those glucocorticoids to change what's going on with the blood sugar level. All of those in response to ACTH from my corticotroph. Next door, we see our last axis that we talked about, the HPS axis. This is the axis that secretes growth hormone. Growth hormone talks to many different types of tissues and leads them to grow. We change the way that they metabolize, and then we get a message from the liver that tells them to grow. Use this to help you study what actually happens at the end of these axes. It's a good summary of that. You'll also notice on this picture though, remember those blood vessels I told you about? The hypophysial portal system? Here's a good way for us to see it. So we've got our blood vessels up here by the neurons. Those blood vessels get the messages, the releasing and inhibiting hormones from the neurons. They travel down into this big pathway of blood vessels on the anterior pituitary gland. That causes each of the different types of cells that are in the anterior pituitary gland to spit out what they're supposed to spit out. Remember, in the posterior pituitary gland, How we actually spit out our different hormones is that the neurons from the hypothalamus go all the way down into the posterior pituitary gland. They spit out their hormones through the posterior pituitary gland and lead to these effects in the body. So for example, the antidiuretic hormone talks to the kidneys, tells them to increase their permeability to water, bring more of that water back in. The other hormone that's spit out by the posterior pituitary gland is oxytocin. Oxytocin talks both to the liver, the uterus, and the mammary glands. In these two organs, it either triggers the process of contractions for childbirth, or it works together with prolactin to stimulate the process of milk production. So this picture, a great summary of all of the hormones related to the pituitary gland. What hormones do we use in the process? What do they target? And ultimately, what happens when they're circulating in the blood? Use this along with the other pictures from your notes to help you study these various different organs that are targeted by each of the hormones.